When you read Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, most readers picture the Queen's croquet game playing out in their minds. The ground was full of ridges and furrows. The balls were live hedgehogs. The mallets were live flamingos, and the soldiers had to bend themselves up and stand on their hands and feet to make the arches. Some readers might picture clear details, such as the pattern of the hedgehog's quills or the red color in the Queen's face. However, a small number of readers have a very different experience. As the scene happens on the page, inside their heads, they see absolutely nothing. This inability to clearly picture images in the mind's eye is called aphantasia, and it affects around 4% of the world's population. It was first described by a psychologist in the 19th century who asked study participants to picture their breakfast table and then rate the vividness and color of this mental picture. He decided that mental imagery exists on a spectrum. At one end are people with aphantasia, and at the other are people with hyperphantasia, with imagery so real it almost matches seeing. And most people fall somewhere between these two extremes. But how do we know if someone with aphantasia isn't describing the same experience as someone with mental imagery, just using different words? In other words, how do we objectively measure what's happening in someone else's mind? In one study, scientists looked for clues in people's eyes. They studied differences in pupillary light reflexes, or how the pupil automatically gets smaller in response to light. Even just imagining that you are looking into a light will make the pupil narrow. Or at least it will, if you have mental imagery. They found that the eyes of people with aphantasia don't get smaller when imagining light. Brain imaging studies may help explain another puzzling phenomenon. People with aphantasia can see mental imagery when they dream. How this happens is likely explained by the different ways the brain creates deliberate visualization versus dream imagery. Usually, making a mental image involves multiple brain regions and is sometimes called a top-down process. First, actively. Trying to picture an object activates cognitive control regions of our brain. This then drives activity in regions of the brain linked to memory and vision, creating a mental picture. People with hyperphantasia tend to have stronger connections between these regions than people with aphantasia. As for dreaming, many scientists believe this imagery is made by a different bottom-up pathway, through activity deep in the brain spontaneously activating visual and memory systems. So, what causes the spectrum of mental imagery to develop? Aphantasia often runs in families, suggesting that the vividness of your mental canvas may be influenced by your genes. While most people with aphantasia have it their whole lives, some people can develop it later in life, often because of brain injury or psychological conditions. But in most cases, imagery extremes aren't seen as disorders that need treatment, but instead as interesting variations in human experience. For example, for those with a mind's eye, the excitement of a thrilling story will make them sweat a little, even if they don't notice it. People with aphantasia, however, do not have this sweat response, probably because it depends on the emotional effect of imagining the storyline. At the same time, scientists have suggested that aphantasia may protect against certain mental health disorders, especially those linked to negative imagery, like PTSD, though more research is needed. Remembering details, like the food served at last year's holiday party, may not be as hard for people with hyperphantasia, because they tend to have a richer memory of past events and can relive these experiences in greater detail. Differences in mental imagery may even affect your career choice. A survey of over 2,000 people found that those with aphantasia are more likely to work in STEM professions, while people with hyperphantasia tend to move toward jobs in the arts, media, and design. We may never be able to fully understand what's happening in another person's mind. The inner worlds of the people around you might be very different from your own.